Hi, this is Scott Bradfield. This is the totally independent, ultimate beginner's guide to creative reading and writing for idiots by an idiot. It's an incredibly long title for this course. It will be changing over the years, so please excuse me if you see an old video where I've changed the title a million times. It's basically the premise of our course is that we're trying to read good books as writers and learn from good writers. And the secondary premise of the course is that everything you learn in education about literature is completely useless to writing. It is all about everything but the craft of writing good fiction. And our challenge this term is to deal with a writer, one of the probably the most complicated, intelligent, sophisticated, erudite. You can use any words you like. There's a lot of words that will fit for Nabokov. Confusing, infuriating, exacerbating, misunderstood. We can use a lot of words on Nabokov, but the one that I would like you to think about this term is the technique of Nabokov, which is sometimes absolutely brilliant and off the planet. He is one of the best writers we've ever had in terms of good fiction. And I don't want to say good of great literature, because I'm going to argue pretty much, particularly right now, that when we think about literature, we think about all the wrong things. For example, we often come to writers for the work that they did later in their life. Nabokov is best known for the novel Lolita. We will be talking about that later this term. But Lolita was the book that made Nabokov famous. It made him notorious. And as you've known from the exercises this week, much of our knowledge and understanding and misunderstanding of Nabokov comes from a novel called Lolita. Now, what happens in literature and in academic courses and in MA and PhD courses is everyone studies these great late books of writers. And Lolita is a very good example. It was a notorious book. It came out about child molestation. It's been talked about child abuse. It's talked about in the manipulation of the narrator. And it's also talked about as a passionate book and a beautiful book, blah, blah, blah. What we want to think about is that when we find a good writer, we shouldn't be reading the, quote, great books of that writer. We should be looking at how they developed. We should be looking at the types of books they wrote when they started out. And we should looking at them as writers who are continually dealing with the troublesome beast of the novel and the equally troublesome beast of the short story and doing different things with it all the time. So we're going to talk tonight particularly about an early Nabokov novel. Now, the other things that happen is that we by looking at the late classics of novelists, whether it's Ulysses by James Joyce or Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce, these are two very complex, deep, complicated, sometimes brilliant novels by a writer who started off writing pretty clear and not difficult short stories. We start to look at those late books, we start to look at them back. We're looking at them backwards. We're looking at the way they extended their techniques towards something that they created. Whereas the fundamental techniques, the ones that most of my students need to learn, the beginning techniques, are in these early books. They sometimes find their greatest fulfillment in the writer's later books, sometimes, but sometimes they're just as good in these early books. So we want to try to be, we want to be readers, we want to be writers, and we don't want to be idiots. Or we do want to be idiots in the way that's useful to us. And we're going to argue that all of these academic diatribes about what Lolita means, what Nabokov means, these talking heads talking on these academic documentaries, they're not helping you enjoy him. Now, the other thing we've talked about this week is our personal memories of reading and how the memories of our lives sometimes shape and misshape our appreciation of books. For example, we might get a book in school and be told, oh, it's a classic. you should like it. And because we hear that, we think, oh, eventually I found something in that book that I liked because it reminded me of something in my life, so it was a very good moment for me. You're thinking backwards. You should be reading these books and the books that come off the page to you as soon as you get there, as soon as you pick them up. I'm picking Laughter in the Dark this term because I had loved Lolita as a young boy, really 16 or 17. I read it knowing about the supposedly, unpleasant quality of this book. And when I read it, there was nothing unpleasant about it at all. I'm not saying that the relationship between Lolita and Humbert isn't disturbing, but it was actually the way fiction worked in that novel. And we'll talk about that in a few weeks, and the way it wrapped me up in the story and the way the story took me off, which is what interested me. And I'd never thought twice about how I was understanding the psychology of a child abuser. I didn't think once about it because I was too busy wrapped up in the story that Nabokov wrote for me. Now, I had read many other Nabokov books. Everything Nabokov has written is worth reading. Learning about his life is quite useful because he's often misunderstood as some peculiar old man or some twisted old man, or he was a very, very very middle class, happy, well-educated man who enjoyed his life. He was not a cynic, as some people think. He was not a bitter man. He was a very happy man. He had a happy marriage. He seemed to have a very good relationship with his son, and he liked teaching. And when he didn't have to teach, he enjoyed not teaching so he could write. And he loved writing books and catching butterflies. I'm giving a very quick summation of Nabokov. But he loved to write books. And his interest in writing books is worth pursuing over many years, not just a 10-minute video. Now, Laughter in the Dark, I came to after reading many of his books, and many of Nabokov's books are a bit exasperating. They take a lot of time. Lolita is one of them. They take a lot of time to understand. You need to read all of his books. They need to be read many times. But for a good writer, it's the first time for your reader that counts. You need your reader to catch you the first time and get something out of your book that first time. And that's all we're trying to do in these beginning classes, because we're all beginners, is to write these books that people will read. Then they can reread them later. So I remember reading Nabokov's Laughter in the Dark, came to it late in my life. It was like 15 years ago. And I picked it off the shelf on the way to the airport. And it was one of those books that, having read lots of Nabokov and been perplexed by some of Nabokov, and have had taught Lolita many times and continued to love Lolita as a novel, this was the one that I picked up and I started reading it on the way to the airport. And I was basically like this, going through customs, doing through check-in and check-out on the plane. I couldn't put it down. I enjoyed the book. And we'll talk about things that happen later in the book. But there were certain techniques about the novel which grab you immediately. It's not just the story, it's the ability to tell the story properly that makes an exciting book. So let's look at a couple of things right off. And I want you to think about these when we get into Lolita. I won't talk a lot about them now. But no one is more clear on the page about how to tell a story. Nabokov loves stories. That's the other thing to remember. Nabokov isn't trying to show the meaning of Western democracy or analyze the contemporary moral poverty of America. He doesn't care about any of that stuff. He loves to tell stories, and he loves to read stories. And like all good writers, you read him, and he talks about the books he loved when he was young. He talks about those books he loved when he was young. Think about that. I teach all the time. And getting people to tell me about the books they love, it's like a glaze comes over their eyes. And there's just like no sort of a passion for just having read a book that they loved, and many books that they loved. And Nabokov loved reading books. And he talked about them throughout his life, and he loved teaching those books. Telling stories is a big thing for Nabokov. And the very first paragraph of Laughter in the Dark is telling us that. We're going to hear a story. We're not going to hear about the meaning of contemporary culture or the problems of totalitarianism. We're going to hear a story. And when someone tells you a story, they capture you. That's the trick. You got to capture them. Once upon a time, there lived in Berlin, Germany, a man called Albinus. The first sentence of the book. He was rich, respectable, happy. One day, he abandoned his wife for the sake of a youthful mistress. He loved, was not loved, and his life ended in disaster. This is the whole of the story. Now let's abandon every academic essay ever written about this book. And as writers, what are we seeing him do? He is telling a story in 5 sentences. All the things we talk about, narrative sentences, one action after another, sequentiality, who is the story about? It's about Albinus. It's not multiple point of views, jump, jump, jump. Who's this? Pop around in time, tell this, blah, blah, blah. And every sentence is an action. It's not analyzing. It's not explaining. Nabokov hates analysis, by the way. No one hates Freud more than Nabokov. He's not analyzing. He's telling us a story. Once upon a time, it ended in disaster. Beginning, middle, end. Now, this is a funny little gimmick to open his story, but it's a story. And now what he's telling us is that the next thing to do is to fill in the details. This is what we've been talking about. I've been talking about trying to teaching for years. You have to have a story, and then you add details to the story. You don't add an explanation. You don't add flashbacks. You don't explain what people did before they were born. You tell the story, and then you bring the details in. And as Nabokov says within a paragraph, it's the conjurer's trick we're going to do now. I've told you the story. This is the young lady who's coming onto the stage. I'm going to make her disappear. You tell your audience what you're going to do for them. Okay? And then you fill in the details. You make the big palaver. You tell everything. Now, Nabokov is a very, very reflective short story novelist and short story writer. He's a very, very complicated novelist and short story writer. And he's a very explicit novelist and short story writer. And he goes in for detail after detail. And he retells the story from that point on with extreme detail. Not as much detail as we'll see in later novels, but with a lot of detail. Now, so I'm checking my my notes here. I want to just pick a couple of places here. I'm not going to do any sort of analysis of some of the games he's playing. But he starts to tell story after story. And he tells it in Albinus' life, and he tells it in Albinus' life sequentially. For example, here's a nice little passage on page 16. Look for sequence in Nabokov. He's going to complicate the story in many ways, but he will always come back to sequence. Nice little stories, nice little fairy tales, nice little brief stories throughout the novel. Page 16. How Albinus gets married to Elizabeth. He married her because it just happened so. A trip to the mountains in her company, plus her fat brother and a remarkably athletic female cousin who, thank God, finally sprained an ankle in Pontresina, was chiefly responsible for their union. There was something so dainty, so airy about Elizabeth, and she had such a good-natured laugh. They were married in Munich, in order to escape the onslaught of their many Berlin acquaintances. The chestnuts were in full bloom. A much-treasured cigarette case was lost in a forgotten garden. One of the waiters at the hotel could speak 7 languages. Elizabeth proved to have a tender little scar, the result of appendicitis. Now, these might seem like inconsequential details, but when you take what are details, and what are clear details in the progress of this marriage, and you see them from Albinus' point of view, that he remembers the 7 languages, that he remembers this dainty little appendix scar, and that we have the story, the fat brother-in-law, then we go here, then we go there, and finally, we have this revelation on the wedding night of the tiny scar. We have a little story. And Nabokov is going to do that over and over in his novels. He's going to play with how he tells the stories. But in his earliest novels, like all of us, he's telling those stories as clearly and as simply as he can. And I'm going to leave it at that this week. I want to talk next week a little bit more about the shifting point of view in it, because it's not shifting in a complex way. It's shifting in a very clear way throughout the novel. And just say, again, this first third of the novel has this great narrative momentum. We know who the story's about immediately. It's about Albinus. We're going to see Margot's point of view. We're going to see Paul's point of view. We're going to even go see to Rex, this horrible man, Axel Rex, which we need to talk about, and think about point of view in that with Axel Rex. What do we know about Axel Rex, and how does he appear in the narrative? We're going to talk about that next week. Okay, thanks very much. And again, it's whether you try to enjoy the books you read, ignore everything they told you in school, try to have pleasure with these books, and don't be afraid of the serious writers. A lot of them are terrible, but Nabokov is worth giving a lot of tries to. Thanks a lot. Bye.